Other way to do this, if your image is the same size as your canvas or paper that you're going to work on. Actually, I don't know if this would work on canvas because you'd have to push too hard, but if you're working on watercolor paper, instead of doing the grid method, you can use a piece of carbon paper between your image and your watercolor paper and just trace with a sharp, hard pencil, not too hard, maybe a 2H, trace the important, not trace everything, but trace the things that you want to make sure you get the size, perspective, placement correct. So maybe just the main things in front and maybe a couple of the background stalks, just to, not that this is all that important, but with some things, with buildings and perspective and faces and stuff like that, getting things in the right place is really important in the beginning. So this is what my image looks like on my printer paper. And then what you do is you take your watercolor paper and you make the same grid first. So again, I've already done my drawing, so I'm not going to show that to you yet. I'm just going to explain. You get your watercolor paper, and in this case it's 8 by 10. By the way, I'll do another explanation about if your image, I'm calling this my image, if my printed image, my reference, that's what I should call it. If my reference photo is a different size than my painting is going to be, there's a whole nother set of concerns that I'll explain in a different post. But in this example, it's the same size. So the next step is, with my watercolor paper, I first of all did a border. Always do a border with watercolor paper. If your watercolor paper is 140 pounds or less, then you need to, which I don't recommend anything less than 140 pounds, but if your watercolor paper is not the real heavy, stiff board-like, then in order to keep it from buckling, you need to tape it down. So when you tape it down, you naturally create a small border over the edge. And I would say at least a 1/2 inch is a good rule of thumb to make sure that your tape overlaps the edge of your paper 1/2 inch. Then when you get ready to mount it, put underneath mat board, and then you have something to overlap so that the edges are not visible if you're matting and framing or putting in sleeves. All right, so back to transferring using the grid method. Once you've taped down your watercolor paper, or if your paper is hard, stiff enough, heavyweight enough that you don't need to do that, then measure a border at least 1/2 inch. And my paper was, that's interesting. My paper, so here it is with the border. In order for it to be 8 by 10, and I try to do standard size, so that when I get ready to buy a mat, I don't have to get a custom mat. So this is my 8 by 10. Then I measured, again, I divided it in quarters, half and then quarters in both directions, and drew very faint lines across to make my grid. Then you work a square at a time, copying your image. So I always start, I'm right-handed, so I always start in the upper left corner and work out and down. So I started in this corner, and all I have to transfer to my watercolor paper is what's in that image. Sometimes I'll do 2 at a time if there's a diagonal line like this to try to get it, make sure it's in the right place. So I just go square by square, drawing what's there. You can make adjustments later, and I try to do it very light so that it's not too dominant. But so here is my drawing, my completed drawing, and you can see that it's the same idea. And I drew the focal points, the main forward flowers that I want. I did the lines a little thicker, and it doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to draw every detail, but the primary shapes and directions that you want to capture, and any major highlights or shadows that are dramatic that you want to capture, it's good to put those in. So this is all pretty much the same level. I would say the stuff in the background I drew a little lighter, and I didn't connect every line. I've left room for adjustments later when I start working on the background. But that's all I wanted to explain in this first video, is how to get started. And that's sometimes for me one of the hardest things. So I'll just go over what I mentioned so far. Get a collection of photos, your own reference photos you want to work with. Make sure you took the photo. It's good to get in the habit now so you don't have copyright infringements. Don't just get an image off the internet. Don't use photos from magazines. Start with a photo you took. If you're a beginner, I would say start with something a little more simple than this. This is a little bit much. Something simple, an apple, an orange, whatever, with as little background details as possible. But if you're thinking of doing this, go through your own photos, make a designated album that's easy to find with photos you've taken that would be fun to paint, that you'd like to paint, have a wide range. Then before you get ready to start on your challenge or your project, choose 2 or 3 and print those out. Then choose your watercolor paper, or I'm just going to stick with watercolor as my example since that's what I'm doing. Get your watercolor paper. Again, it's easier in the beginning if your image is printed about the same size. So I would say either 5x7 or 8x10 is a good place to start. And you can print that image out, same size, get your paper, have a border, then divide it. You can either divide by thirds or quarters. It's just a preference, and it kind of depends. You know, if I'm doing a 9x12, then thirds are a little bit easier and make sense. When I'm doing 8x10, and it also depends on how much detail you have going on, if you want smaller squares or larger squares. Then draw your grid on your reference photo, and then draw the same grid on your watercolor paper, and then work a square at a time in a way that your hand won't smear your drawing. Use a HB pencil or a number 2 pencil. Draw as lightly as you can, but where you can still see the details you need to see. The background, maybe try to do less drawing of the background unless there's something really important in it, and make those pencil marks a little lighter. And the image that you want to focus on, you can make that just a little darker. And in fact, probably what I'll do this next step is on my piece, I will probably go back in and darken my focal point, those forward flowers that I want to focus on. I'll darken those a little bit so that the rest recedes, and then I'll explain what's next. So good luck, have fun. And ask questions if you have comments or questions for the video, please ask, and I will also be adding more content in the description of the videos. And excuse the low budget production quality of this. I'm just using my iPad and my built-in camera, and it's new, so it's not going to be perfect. That's one of my challenges to myself, is don't wait till things can be perfect to do it. So here's my imperfect video on how to get started on working from a photo to do a watercolor painting. Thank you.